All right, good morning, everybody. It is today is September 17th, and let's go ahead and get started. I want to remind everybody that Quiz 2 has opened today, right? And you have until Sunday at what time? 8 o'clock. That's right. You have till Sunday at 8 o'clock to take the quiz, so make sure you get that done. Also, we have the two discussions, right? Discussions 3 and 4 for Module 2. Those are due by tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. So make sure we get all of that done. And if anybody has any questions on that, please, by all means, get in touch with me. I want to clarify any issues. Okay, when we left off, we were between a rock and a hard place when it came to the colonial governance of what would become the United States. The English colonies were governed completely by Britain. The American people don't have any real say in their laws, any real say in how they are to live in that regard. But at the same time, up until now, they have paid no taxes. And they have paid no taxes because they are not self-governing. That is part of the English system. You cannot tax people without their consent. And so the American people cannot really be legally taxed. And this is not just tradition by, the 18th century, This is a law. Well, we started putting taxes on them. Parliament started putting a variety of admittedly minor taxes, but nonetheless taxes. And this was not something that the American people were going to tolerate. If you want to tax us, then we have to be represented in Parliament. That is the English way. That is English law. And Parliament was simply not willing to consent to this because, of course, opening up Parliament to colonial people would cause chaos. It's just Parliament is not a workable body if the whole of the British Empire is represented. At least that's the way they would look at it. So there we go. And, of course, resistance to the taxes had meant that British regulars are now being sent to the American colonies. They are patrolling the streets. They are there to maintain order, which we can understand it would be considered necessary. We can't have rioting in the streets. We can't have armed resistance. The law is the law, after all. But nonetheless, to the American people, this is what tyrants do. When you push back against a despot, he sends in his army to crush you. And that is exactly what these British soldiers were there for if you are an American. So there we have it. We talked about the Boston Massacre. We talked about the Boston Tea Party, the shutting down of Boston. There were, in fact, several of these events, several tea parties that took place across the colonies. It wasn't just Boston. We now have the meeting of a Continental Congress, which is calling for resistance to these taxes and not armed resistance to British rule. In 1774, that's not what they're talking about. But they are asserting that there's going to have to be a resolution that gives the American people consent, that gives the American people a degree of self-governance if taxes are going to take place. Well, moving forward, we begin to see militias becoming more active. The Boston Minutemen were a group of militiamen that were getting their guns together, and of course, if the redcoats are going to start firing on our people, we are going to be there to fire back. So we're talking about potential civil war. In April of 1775, with tension being tremendously high, the British sent a contingent of soldiers to seize the arsenal, to take the guns from the militiamen near Boston, an area known as Lexington and Concord. This is outside of Boston. And this is the event where Paul Revere and William Dawes got up in the middle of the night and rode through the towns telling people that the British were coming. And so the Minutemen mustered, and of course, the shot heard round the world was the Minutemen fighting back against the British. But let's pause for a minute. These are considered the first shots of the American Revolution. What I want to do before we get into that is I want to talk about a few of the figures that we've all heard of, and we're going to just go into very brief biographies. There are many men that we would put into the category of founding father. We can't talk about all of them. Let's just mention a few. One, of course, is a fellow we've all heard of, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was, by any measure, a pivotal figure in the shaping of the American identity. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He was born in Boston. And his father was a candle maker. So he was part of the skilled working class. And he had several brothers and sisters. They were not poor, but they certainly weren't wealthy either. And by all accounts, he had a kind of a tough upbringing, but his parents did care about him. Ben was known to be mischievous and difficult, also highly intelligent. As a young man, he moved to Philadelphia and became an apprentice at his brother's print shop. And so he became a printer, if you will. And he eventually went on to become a printer in his own right. And because newspapers need a lot of stuff to print, an awful lot of what went into his newspaper was written by him. And so he would write a lot of the articles and write a lot of the news, and then he would also send it out. And by the time he was about 30, Ben was a pretty wealthy guy. His newspapers and his publications were being sold pretty far away. He was very good at logistics, meaning he was very good at getting the newspapers out to the people that needed them. He understood that a distribution network is every bit as important as the quality of the paper. And so he was good at delivering the goods. He was also a brilliant writer. He would write articles that were funny. He would write articles that would really make you think. By the time he was in middle age, he was, for lack of a better description, a celebrity of the time. Everybody who was literate in the colonies would have heard of Ben Franklin in one way or another. And he even became popular over in Europe. Ben traveled to Europe, and he would be seen at the courts of various noblemen and kings, because it was sort of a cool thing to have Ben Franklin visiting your court. And there's always these old stories that Ben Franklin, being an American from Pennsylvania, and that's really where he identified as, even though he was born in Boston, he saw himself as really from Pennsylvania. They wanted to see, the rugged American lifestyle. And so he would dress as a frontiersman. He'd put on a costume of animal skin and all of this as if he was a frontiersman. But he was a city guy. I mean, he never lived on the frontier at all. He wore nice clothes and all of that. Ben, of course, if you don't know this, he loved the ladies. And I really mean he loved the ladies. The right girl for him was the one that couldn't run faster. Okay, I mean, he loved them all. He didn't care. Every single female was his type, and he proved it throughout his entire life. And for some reason, the women loved Ben Franklin. I mean, they just went after him like you wouldn't believe. And we can see right here, just by looking at him, why the women would find him so attractive, I suppose. Young women, attractive, eligible women were going after old man Ben Franklin like crazy. And the letters they wrote him, really, these were something else. Ben had a sense of humor. He loved dirty jokes, right? He loved, poking at people. He loved breaking social norms and making people squirm. He would always tell bawdy stories and sing bawdy songs with people and did not act distinguished in that way at all. He liked fart jokes so much, he wrote the book on it. And I'm not making that up. He really did. He wrote a book of fart jokes. Because why not, right? He was Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, as a young man, was involved in slave trading. But by the time he was in his mid-30s, he had really come to despise slavery. He had come to see it as something that he could not endorse or have anything to do with. He came to see it not just as a economically bad idea, but just as morally wrong. He founded the first anti-slave society in the United States, and by the time he was a senior, was an outspoken advocate for abolition. Just openly hating all of it and making it clear that the best thing we can do is get rid of slavery as soon as possible. And so as a young man, he was involved with it and profited with it. I believe he even owned slaves for a while, but that was not going to be something that he liked. He was clearly a strong voice against it. By the time the revolution comes around, he's kind of the old man of the founding fathers. He's the senior among them. He's the one that they all look up to. He played a big role during the revolution in trying to secure funding, trying to get help from Europe when the revolution would take place. And of course, he is going to play a pivotal role in the 1780s up to the Constitutional Convention, pushing through the American Constitution. So his role in the United States, the formation of the United States, simply cannot be underestimated. Let's talk about John Adams. Let's talk about John Adams. John was born in Boston and raised in Boston, lived there his whole life. Like Ben, he came from what we would call sort of a middle-class family. And he was a city guy, just like Franklin. John was highly intelligent. He became a lawyer and a darn good one. I've already mentioned that when the Boston Massacre took place, he was the only lawyer that was willing to defend the British soldiers in court. And he did it without being paid. He did it pro bono. And he argued that it cannot be considered justice if they are not represented, fairly. It is mob justice if we accuse them and convict them of this crime without them being allowed to defend themselves fairly. So somebody has to represent him, and that somebody's going to have to be me. That's the way he looked at it. And as their lawyer, he actually got them off. They were found not guilty by a colonial court because of John Adams. And I don't need to tell you that his reputation as a lawyer pretty much tanked after that. Apparently he lost half of his business and almost went bankrupt. But through the rest of his life, he was always very proud of the fact that he was willing to be a lawyer for the accused. He said, we cannot have a legal system if the accused do not have representation. John would later be very much an intellectual moving forward in the 1780s. He continued to promote the American system. He did not fight in the American Revolution, of course. He was never a soldier. He was very much a nerd, kind of a weakling in that regard, certainly. He served at the Constitutional Convention and, of course, would become the second president. He would become the second president. And in terms of his political ideology, he would be a Federalist. He was very much allied with George Washington in that regard. His son would go on to become president as well. And so that's Adams for us. And as we said, his son will go on to become president as well. And even his grandson would play a pretty big role in the U.S. government. And of course, this is his home, by the way. This is his home, still preserved today. This is his estate, a very, very nice home by the standards of the day. What's that? Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, his house has been preserved. For the most part, the homes of every president are available. You can go to home of just about every former president. I don't know of any that aren't available to go to. A couple are like maybe their childhood home or something like that, or the little cabin they were born in. But there's a structure that you can go to see just about everything. I wouldn't think so. I imagine it's just a public museum, place. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry, was that? Yeah, Mount Vernon. We're about to see that right here. Yeah, Mount Vernon. Speaking of Mount Vernon, we got to talk about old George, right? We have to talk about George. We're going to spend a little bit more time on him. George Washington was from Virginia. So Franklin is from Boston/Philadelphia. Adams is from Boston. Washington is a Virginian, making him a Southerner. Washington's father was a planter. So he was born into advantageous circumstances. But they were at the low end of the planter class. They were barely in the club. So they did own slaves, they did prosper, but they were by no means what we would call plantation elite. They weren't there. They were just better off than your average farmer. But that did give Washington a lot of advantages. When Washington was 11 years old, his father died. And that meant that moving forward, George was basically on his own. He did have an older brother. He was not going to inherit very much. And what Washington would later say is that the real problem with him losing his father meant that he was likely not going to get the education that he wanted. Because you see, had his father lived, he would have been sent off to a good school or at least had an opportunity to go to a school. And Washington knew, without a good education, I can't do it. And so what Washington did more or less as a teenager is strike out on his own. He was very much a self-made man, despite having been born into a well-off family. Washington spent his youth, he served in the colonial militia. He tried to become an officer in the British Army, but they would not accept him, largely because he was a colonist. They didn't like accepting colonists in their officer corps. He did a lot of work surveying. He was a surveyor for a while, and he was very, very good at that. And land speculation was a way to make money. You go out, you survey land, you figure out the good land, then you can turn around and buy it and parcel it into lots and sell it off for more. Land speculation was an enterprise you could make some money at if you did it right, and he did it right. As a young adult, Washington, although still not wealthy, was extremely promising. He had gained a reputation for talent and ability. He had served as an officer in the French and Indian War, even though obviously he didn't do very well. And he ended up marrying rich. He married a woman by the name of Martha Custis. And his wife was the daughter of one of the wealthiest planters in Virginia. They were very, very much plantation elite. So he hit the jackpot, which really is the very best career plan, fellas, if you want to know. Just find a rich woman to marry, you're good, right? Problem solved. He overnight found himself as one of the elite planters of Virginia because of his marriage. His plantation would be known as Mount Vernon. That's the Potomac River behind him. It was a large tobacco operation. It made a lot of money. George did a lot to it to grow it and make it work well. By the time he was middle-aged, by about 1770, he was far wealthier than he had even married into. He brewed whiskey, and you can buy George Washington's whiskey today. They make whiskey based on his recipes, so go buy yourself a bottle. And Mount Vernon was just one of those real jewels of Virginia. I don't know how many slaves he had, but it was a lot. Now, the reason why you want your plantation to be right on the river there is because that's how you export your crop, right? You grow your tobacco, put it on a barge on the river, ship it out, profit, easy enough. George Washington was personally, again, I don't need to tell you that he was a natural-born leader. I don't need to tell you that he was highly intelligent and capable. He was also kind of a jerk. Going to be honest, he, in many ways, was very conservative socially. He very much believed that people had a class that they belonged to and that it was in their interest to stay in their class. You know, there is a leadership class, there is a working class, etc. And so when it came to sort of what we would say poor farmers or yeoman farmers, George Washington would be polite to them, but he did not see them as his equal. Okay, George Washington, he was kind of a jerk. He believed that people belonged to a certain social class, and although certainly you should be able to move up in your social class, or if you're not particularly hardworking or talented, you should go down. Washington, again, not the friendliest person when it came to when it came to working with people. Washington also did not really see a problem with owning slaves, although there were times where he would try to free slaves that he had a particular affinity for. Virginia law actually prohibited that, and so he wasn't really ever able to legally. But at the end of the day, Washington was very much a racist in that regard. He did not see any reason to end slavery necessarily, both because racially, again, those were his views, and economically, he saw it as profitable. And again, we all sort of have a role to play in society, and the children of Africa have a role to play too, and that's as slaves, and that's just kind of the person that he was. When the war broke out, George Washington was, of course, very much a patriot, very much behind the revolutionary cause. He used his own money to pay for a lot of the war itself. He paid his own soldiers frequently from his own plantation, and he took a lot of economic blows during the war. So he was really willing to put his money where his mouth was on that. And it is very clear that without his leadership, the colonial military would probably have collapsed. I don't see how it's possible for the revolution to have succeeded without him leading the colonial army. He was a military man the minute the war broke out, and he remained a military man for the rest of his life. When the war ended, it was no doubt that he was the most popular man in the country, and it was a no-brainer that he would become the first president once the Constitution was ratified. He is the only man to run for president unopposed. So to just let you know, he was the founding father of our country, the number one founding father then, just like he is today. Let's move on to Tom. Of course, the other founding father that people know is extremely significant, also from Virginia. Jefferson was born into the plantation elite. Like Washington, he was born in this society, but unlike Washington, he was not on the low end. He was born on the high end. And he would be plantation elite for his entire life. He never struggled financially, or at least you never saw him struggling financially. He did tend to put himself into a lot of debt, but nevertheless, Jefferson was highly, highly intelligent. He was just a super freak genius. Rumors have it that he had read his entire father's library, the entire library of his father, by the time he was 5 years old. Now, that's not possible, of course. That's certainly not going to have been the case. But he was probably highly literate by 5 years old. That's certainly a reasonable assumption. Jefferson was at the core very much an academic. He mastered every academic field there is. He mastered biology, chemistry, mathematics, history, literature, you name it. Thomas Jefferson studied it and was brilliant at it. Jefferson also was very much behind the colonial and revolutionary cause. Now, when the war broke out, Jefferson was not a soldier. He never fought in the war. Jefferson actually was serving over in Europe trying to gather up support for the war. And so Jefferson was not a soldier like Washington. He was more like Adams in that regard. Jefferson and Washington did not see eye to eye in terms of how a nation should be governed. Jefferson saw America as a place where small farmers should thrive. Washington and Adams saw it as a place where we should push business and commerce. And so ideologically, they were very different. Jefferson would, of course, go on to write the Declaration of Independence. We know that. But that was far from the only thing he did. And Jefferson will serve as the third president. Washington was president 1, Adams was president 2. Thomas Jefferson will be president number 3. Unlike Washington, Jefferson did not like slavery. Now, there's a lot of hypocrisy here, as we could obviously see. But Jefferson, as an older man, came to call slavery a hideous blight. That is a quote that he used. He worked very hard to stop the slave trade. He stopped it in Virginia. And he openly advocated for slavery to eventually come to an end. Now, obviously, the hypocrisy there is the fact that he was a slave owner. He owned lots of slaves at Monticello, his plantation. He owned them his entire life. He could not have freed them if he wanted to. Again, Virginia law prohibited the manumission of slaves like that. But nonetheless, Jefferson openly said this is something we've got to get rid of. He described slavery as having a wolf by the ears. You can't hang on, but you can't let go either. It's one of these situations where we just kind of got to sort it out, and it's not going to be easy. Jefferson was not very skilled socially. Ben Franklin was popular and everybody liked him. Washington was popular and socialized and whatever. Thomas Jefferson was not. He did not like crowds. He did not like being around people in formal environments. Some think that he might have had some version of autism or something along those lines, that, highly, highly intelligent, but very awkward socially, some sort of a savant or something like that. There's no way to know for sure, of course. And more recently, when we talk about Jefferson, what's the one subject that tends to come up more than anything else now? It's not so much of him as a founding father. Does anybody know? It has to do with a relationship that he likely had with one of his slaves, a woman by the name of Sally Hemings. Now, this is not guaranteed to have been Jefferson. It might have been his brother, okay? It could have been his brother, but it probably was Jefferson. When Jefferson was in his 40s, he started a romantic relationship. He was a widower by then. He started a romantic relationship with one of his slaves who was a teenager at the time. Her name was Sally Hemings. She was also the sister-in-law of his deceased wife. Hemings had had 3 white grandparents and 1 black grandparent. So she appeared white. She had a very fair complexion. She was described as being, quote unquote, passable as white. But nonetheless, she was one of his slaves. They had several children together. And I don't need to tell you the myriad of disturbing doors that this opens. Not only was she obviously not really old enough to be in a relationship with him, but this was not an equal partnership. This was a situation where she was a slave and he was the master, so it's not like she really has much of an option in the deal. Most accounts show this as a relationship that was genuinely affectionate. He genuinely cared about her and she genuinely cared about him. But nonetheless, the disturbing imbalance going on here and what this really represents is very troubling indeed. And it has cast a bit of a dark shadow on Jefferson's legacy, because not only was he a slave owner, but he was a slave owner who took sexual advantage of his slaves. So you just kind of have to sort through that one on your own. For a long time, there were people that claimed to be descendants of Jefferson who were black. And some of Sally Hemings's children did go into the world as blacks. They did marry blacks. So there were black people who were saying, I'm a descendant of Thomas Jefferson. And it had always been kind of a rumor. It had always been discussed, but it had never been proven. And then in the late 1990s, DNA enabled testing to be done. And sure enough, there is no question that there are people of African descent that are also descendants of either Jefferson or his brother. But let's face it, it was almost certainly Jefferson. So that's a thing now, and so again, you can sort that one out yourself. But it has opened the door to the conversation of what were the relationships that were interracial at this time. And yes, there were interracial relationships that went on. They just weren't what we would like to think they were. Anyway, moving on to the next founding father. How about Alexander Hamilton? Before that. This is Monticello, and it is Thomas Jefferson's home. Jefferson designed it himself. He was the architect. Again, he did all of it. It is a very good example of a plantation estate. It is modeled after the Roman Pantheon. That's the dome and the columns up front. And of course, the U.S. Capitol building is modeled after this in the Pantheon as well. And so if that looks familiar, well, it's supposed to. Now, you have seen Monticello many, 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 many times in your life, far more than you probably would even be able to count. Where have you seen this all the time? Does anybody know where this picture shows up? This is on the back of the nickel. So if anybody's got a nickel, pull it out and take a look, and you'll see Monticello on the back. And so that's what that's all about. How about Hamilton, right? Everybody wants to talk about Hamilton, right? Here we go. Here we have Alexander Hamilton, right? His name is Alexander Hamilton, right? There's a million things that he wanted to get done. Kidding, of course. That's the real Hamilton. We're not really going to talk about him right now because Hamilton didn't play a role he didn't play a notable role in the Revolution itself. He was George Washington's aide. He did fight in the war, but if Ben Franklin was the old man among the founding fathers, Hamilton is the young man among the founding fathers. And he was not in the Continental Congress. He didn't do anything like that. Hamilton is going to emerge after the war and play a big role at the Constitutional Convention and in George Washington's cabinet. So he is a very important founding father, but not during the American Revolution. He was just an officer who served with Washington. And Washington sort of took him under his wing, and Washington promoted him and saw to it that he had a lot of advantages. Well, let's get back to Lexington and Concord. So the British show up. They attempt to disarm the militia, the Minutemen. The Minutemen fought back, refused to cooperate. And rather than engage in a drawn-out, pitched battle, the British simply retreated back to Boston because we don't really want too many people to be killed here. And yes, there were several casualties on both sides. But the British exercised restraint and went back to Boston. After this, Boston effectively rose up against the British and practically drove them out. And the British withdrew from Boston recognizing that we're going to have civil war on our hands if we don't. It wasn't that they weren't willing to fight. It's that they wanted to have a peaceful resolution to whatever the heck is going on here. As 1775 progresses, militia units across the colonies begin pushing back against British occupation. They run out the governor of Virginia, for example, because he was a loyalist who pushed for the, support for the crown. Some of them actually invaded Canada. There were some militiamen that actually invaded Canada. Let's look at European affairs right now, because this will now play a role in this. You see, you will recall that during the 7 Years' War, Britain won, took everything, and the French are humiliated. Y'all remember that, right? Well, now France is looking over at the English colonies and absolutely loving it. Britain humiliated us. They took all of our land in North America, and just a few years later, they have an outright rebellion on their hands. So if you are the French leadership, you want to encourage this, don't you? If you're the French leadership, this is wonderful. Hey, let's help these pesky Americans out. Let's, stick it to the British. It's payback time. It's payback time for what happened to us. Spain is also looking for an opportunity to weaken the British. Spain had been an ally of Britain a few years earlier, but of course what Spain is worried about is British power in North America. The entire Spanish colonial empire is showing real weakness at this point, and they're worried that the British may come in and start taking Spanish territory. And so Spain is really on the American side as well. Now understand, Spain is a third-rate power. Spain can't do much. The Continental Congress again meets in the summer of 1775. And it is a far more radical body than it had been a year earlier. There are no loyalists in the Continental Congress. There is nobody that's really calling for obedience to the king. Everybody is now calling for pushing back. There doesn't seem to be much concern. There doesn't seem to be much concern that Britain is a superpower that could overwhelm any American army out there. The general logic is we're going to fight them. The general logic is we're going to fight them. Oh, and by the way, here is Paul Revere. Actually, that's Jack Black playing Paul Revere. Paul Revere was not a founding father in the traditional sense of the word, but he is one of the sort of early heroes of the Revolution because he was along with William Dawes, actually warned of the British coming to disarm the militia. And like I said, he actually did it with William Dawes. The reason why Paul Revere really became famous is because later on a poem was written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And it was the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. This became a very famous poem that they would teach in schools. And so that's why everybody really knows about Paul Revere. Up until that point, he was really kind of a minor figure. Yeah, that was the idea. The British are coming, riding through the towns. And the story that actually happened is not really what happened in the poem. Again, William Dawes rode with him, and nobody's ever heard of William Dawes, right? But they were both actually equally responsible for this. And Paul Revere was actually captured by the Redcoats during the ride. Dawes was the one who continued it. But the poem itself became famous, and so Paul Revere became famous as a result of that. Well, in early 1776, Parliament is trying to figure out how to deal with this. Obviously, they are going to send over a force. Obviously, we are going to subdue this rebellious activity. Parliament does not want a major war. Parliament wants to just put this down and let the tobacco and other goods keep flowing. A man by the name of Thomas Paine published a pamphlet known as Common Sense. And it's a short little pamphlet. Up to this point, The American people are deeply divided over this, of course. But to tell you the truth, not many of them really understand the philosophy behind this resistance. Now, I don't like paying taxes. You don't like paying taxes, but this isn't really about taxation. This is about representation and governance. This is about who really is in charge here. And so common sense becomes a hugely popular seller. It is banned, but it gets published anyway. And what Thomas Paine is doing is laying out the argument for why we don't need to work with Parliament. We need to be an independent country. He lays out the argument for why we can never be a free people as long as we are a colonial people. That the very concept of colonization is toxic. One group of people cannot rule over another group of people, and it ever be a fair arrangement. Now, it is worth noting that life in the American colonies, if you're not a slave, of course, is probably better than life in England. You have more opportunity to move up. There is a greater life expectancy. General prosperity is higher. Even with these pesky British taxes, your tax burden is still very, very low. Honest to goodness, if you had to choose between the two areas, you'd be better off living in the colonies. And so what Thomas Paine is doing is arguing that it's not about our quality of life, it's about our freedom. It's about the ability to govern ourselves, to choose our own taxes, to choose our own leaders, and that colonies themselves are by their very nature evil. And it is from this that America would be an anti-colonial country, really all the way up until the present. America has always pushed for the independence of people, not the colonization of people. But he's calling for independence. He's saying there's no way that we will ever work this out. We have to be our own country. In June of 1776, the Continental Congress met for the third time now and voted for independence. All of them, of course, had been reading Common Sense. They had been talking among themselves, and they voted to simply declare the United States to be an independent country, or to declare the independent country of the United States. Now, this had never been done before by any colonial people ever. No colony had ever declared independence from the mother country, and the concept of succeeding at it was pretty absurd. There's no other way to put it. The idea of succeeding at it is pretty absurd, especially when we're dealing with a nation like Britain, which can send over enormous numbers of soldiers that are well-trained and well-armed, and Britain has plenty of money to keep the ball rolling. So how are we going to declare independence? Well, what we're going to have to do is write a Declaration of Independence. Okay, let's just write a big old document and declare ourselves free and send a copy to England, and that's that. Who, of course, is the logical figure among our founding fathers to write the Declaration of Independence? Of all the people that we've talked about, who would be the person that makes the most sense? Well, you're on the right track. Actually, the man that would make sense would be Benjamin Franklin. He is the printer, he is the publisher, he is the guy who writes better than anybody else. He's been doing it his whole life. I'm not making this up. They were not going to let him do it on his own because they thought he would put jokes in it. And that is 100% true. Several other founding fathers immediately noped out of it, realizing that the man who writes the Declaration of Independence is guaranteed to be hung should all of this fail. We're all dead men if this fails, but I'm really going to be a dead man if my signature, right, is on the line. Thomas Jefferson was 30 at the time. He volunteered to do it, and again, he was certainly qualified enough. But it's worth noting that Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Adams actually helped him. It was kind of a committee that put this together. although Thomas Jefferson is credited with being the key writer of it. The president of the Continental Congress at the time was John Hancock, and that's why his signature is that first one at the bottom. The Declaration of Independence was finalized and signed on July 4th, but all of the founding fathers of the Continental Congress did not sign it on July 4th. There wasn't a big signing ceremony where they all just sort of lined up and did it. In fact, only a handful signed it at that time. Over the course of the next several weeks, they kind of came and went and signed it, and a few even signed it after the war was over. A few weren't even willing to put their names on it until all was clear. And again, the idea is if your name is on this document, you're a dead man. I mean, this is high treason if ever there was. And so, should we lose this, well, that's it for you. But the Declaration of Independence isn't just a document that says the United States is free. It is a document that criticizes the entire concept of colonization. One group of people cannot rule over another group of people, and it ever be fair. So there we go. Now let's pause again real quick. We're going to have a war, of course. So let's take a quick look. Let's take a quick look real quick at what they're going to be fighting with. This is sort of the standard uniform for a British regular during the era. This is reenactment, of course. British soldiers were extremely well trained. They were extremely well disciplined. You can see why they were called redcoats, although I did point out earlier they weren't called redcoats during the time. That was a term that came around later. As a matter of fact, I think it was the Paul Revere poem that coined the word redcoat. They were often called lobsters. That was a more fun way to refer to them. So the Americans... What's that? They are lobsters? That's what the Americans called them, yeah. The Americans called them lobsters, right? Nobody actually knows why they wore red. That's a big mystery. Why red was chosen. One of the rumors is that it would disguise the blood. If you got shot, you wouldn't see, the enemy wouldn't see the blood. I don't think that that's true, but it may explain also why the French wore brown pants. That might have something to do with that. If you want me to keep making jokes, I can. This is a big part. This is a big part of fighting at the time. This type of musket is commonly known as the Brown Bess, and it was this or a derivative of it was the standard musket that an infantryman would carry at the time. The Brown Bess is smooth bore, meaning the inside of the barrel is completely smooth. It fires a round ball, and I've got a couple of Brown Bess balls here that y'all can take a look at if you want to. I guess we're social distancing, so I won't pass them around, but come up here and take a look after class or whatever. Yeah, you come look. I don't care. I mean, just come take a look. This is you can see it here. It's about a 50 caliber ball of lead.
This is what they use?
Yeah, this is it. And these are real ones. Yeah, this is it. And these are real ones. These are not recreated. These were taken off the battlefield. So these are actual Brown Bess balls from the Revolution. It's lead too, so handle it. Make sure you nice and healthy there. It shoots out of the smooth bore of the Brown Bess, and because it is a smooth bore, this gun is only accurate to about maybe 30 to 50 yards, and that's really stretching it. The bullet starts to wobble pretty quickly once it comes out of the gun. Now, what that means, of course, is that in order to hit the enemy, you got to get kind of close. So we've seen recreations of battles at this time, and they all sort of march in line, and they all sit down, fire, right? And the British sort of invented that firing line. And if you're within that 30 to 50 yard range, when they all fire at once, that's it. It's devastating. But of course, that makes them targets too. And so the two armies would square off against each other and fire into each other until one completely freaked out and ran. So it's a gruesome affair. These being made out of lead also would fragment once they hit your body. And so it didn't go through you, it hit you and then just sort of, splattered through you. And so if it hits your arm, it just blows your arm off. If it hits internal organs, it was just really, really horrific. And of course, without modern medicine, if you get hit by something like this, there you have it. Here are also, just y'all can check out, here are some arrowheads.
Oh, I used to go look for this.
Yeah, did you find some real ones? These, I found these when I was a kid. So these are actual arrowheads made by actual Native Americans. They're not recreations. I found these in Oklahoma. You found one? Yeah? Okay, cool. Now, later on, I'll just show you all now since we've got it. The barrels of these muskets became rifled. What they would do is they would put grooves in them to put a spin on the bullet. And once you rifle a barrel, all of a sudden a bullet can travel hundreds of yards in a straight line and be accurate much, much farther. And so by the mid-19th century, we start seeing rifle barrels. And this is the bullet that was common during the Civil War. And this is known as a mini ball. I've got a few of them here. And these are real mini balls. Again, they were recovered from battlefields, so these date to the Civil War themselves. And what happens is the rifling of the barrel makes it hard to put the bullet in, and so they would drop it down the barrel, and it was a little bit smaller, and then it's got this cavity in the back, and so when the gunpowder went off, the bullet would expand, and it would get into the grooves and get a spin on it. And again, it's made out of lead. It's 54 calibers, and if you get hit with this, it's again devastating. This is your whole day is pretty much ruined. The injuries from the U.S. Civil War were just gruesome. When a mini ball would hit your arm or your leg, I mean, it would just blow the whole thing off. It was just absolutely awful. In any event, this is what would be kind of a standard uniform of an American infantryman. This was designed by George Washington. He loved designing uniforms. The truth is, the Americans during the American Revolution wore whatever they could find. They might wear militia uniforms, they might wear ordinary farmers' clothes. The Continental Army was only a small part of all of the different people that fought during the war. And so real uniforms were kind of hard to come by. So if you were to find a real uniform, this is what you'd see. But there we go. Now, we're not going to get into all the different battles and all the different fighting. What we do need to know, here is the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This is kind of a fun little picture. This is a huge painting. It's a huge painting. And this was made in the 1820s. This was made in the 1820s. And the only founding father, most of the founding fathers were dead by then. Jefferson was still alive and John Adams was still alive. And the only founding father to actually look at this was John Adams. And he was a very old man at that point. And the artist had put a lot of work into it, and it's this big old thing, and it's this great noble painting. And John Adams walked in, and of course the artist was very proud that we have, one of the men in the painting is actually going to get to look at it. And John Adams walked in, he's very slow, he takes a look at it and proclaims that he hates it, it's horrible. It isn't anything like what happened at the time. He says it's nothing but a shin job on him. All these people see is my shins. And then stormed out of the room. So there you go, right? Old men can be a bit cantankerous. I don't know if y'all know that or not, but there we have it. Anyway, let's keep going. There were a few different theaters of the American Revolution. And the American forces, led generally by George Washington, were outgunned and outnumbered in just about every category. And the idea of winning an actual military victory was preposterous. And most of the battles during the Revolution were British victories. There's no other way around it. The British were just so much better at doing the whole war thing than the Americans. That being said, the United States does have some advantages. The United States does have some ways in which we might be able to make this work for us. One, of course, is the fact that we're fighting home field. This is home turf. And that alone is going to give us a number of ways in which we can benefit that the British can't. We've got a local population that is largely willing to support us, even though a lot of Americans were still loyal to the crown and a lot wanted to be left alone. You get the idea. Everything that the British have has to be imported. And it's a long way from England. The guns, the ammo, supplies, you name it, all has to be brought in. All has to be brought in. Also, we don't really have to win this war. We just have to not lose. If we put up a big enough of a fight, Parliament might just decide this war isn't worth it and call it off. We don't need to achieve a military victory. We just have to keep hanging on. And that would ultimately be Washington's strategy. Let's just hang in there as long as possible, and sooner or later they'll just quit. By 1778, the French were openly helping the Americans. This meant weapons, this meant money, this meant support. And there's no doubt that without French help, we would never have won this war. No, I'm not getting into Valley Forge. I'm not getting into the fighting in New York. I'm not getting into Washington crossing the Delaware and all of that. All of these were battles that kind of went back and forth, and generally speaking, the Americans didn't do very well. That's the easiest way to put it. Just as long as you don't quit, you can keep fighting. What really would matter is the Southern Theater. And if you look on this map, there's this Southern Theater down here. By 1780, the war is largely at a stalemate. Britain cannot get us to quit, but at the same time, we can't stop Britain from sending more men and guns. But the South ended up becoming an important theater. The British commander was a man by the name of Cornwallis, Charles Cornwallis. A highly talented British officer. And in October of 1780, he fought a battle on the South Carolina-North Carolina border, and it is the Battle of Kings Mountain. And actually, a lot of his soldiers were American loyalists. A lot of the men fighting for him were Americans in the service of the crown. The Americans called them Tories. And he was defeated by a bunch of militiamen. A lot of them had come from Tennessee and the Carolinas. And the Americans actually defeated him. The Americans won. But again, whether or not they really won is debatable. He decided to withdraw. But it was a bloody nose that he did not want to have to get, if you get my meaning. In March of 1781, farther north, Cornwallis clashed with the Americans again at Guilford Courthouse. Another battle, much bigger than Kings Mountain, was fought at Guilford Courthouse. And this was in North Carolina. And at this battle, the Americans put up one heck of a fight. The colonial armies, the colonial militias, etc., are now really getting some experience. You know, the war's been going on for a few years now, and after a few battles, the Americans are starting to show that they're learning. Eventually, Cornwallis won this battle. This was a victory for him. The Americans lost at Guilford Courthouse. That being said, it was a very, very costly victory. You know, what Cornwallis learned is that these Americans can now put up a fight. It was what we call a Pyrrhic victory. What is a Pyrrhic victory? Does anybody know? It's when you win, but the price you pay wasn't worth it. It's when you win, but the price you paid to win isn't worth it. And so that's what happened here. And Cornwallis knew after Guilford Courthouse, he didn't have the military strength to keep fighting. That if he fought the Americans again in another battle like this, his army could get wiped out. His army was severely weakened after Kings Mountain and this one. And so what he's going to have to do is he's going to have to get resupplied. He's going to have to go and get more men, get more guns, get more material to keep the war going. And so he withdrew to the Virginia coast. He withdrew to the Virginia coast, a place known as Yorktown. A place known as Yorktown. And when he withdrew to Yorktown, Washington knew, we've got him. Because you see, the French Navy was out on the water blocking any supplies from coming in. So he went there to get more men and more ammunition and whatnot, and it was not coming because the French Navy wasn't going to let it. So now he's blockaded. He is now under siege. And after several weeks of constant bombardment by the Americans, he realized no more supplies are coming, so Cornwallis surrendered to Washington. Cornwallis surrendered to Washington. The battle didn't, again, it was just a siege. And of course, the British could have kept fighting. This was not necessarily a victory for the Americans in the big sense. The British could have sent over more men after that, etc. But at that point, Parliament concluded this is no longer worth it. We've been fighting for 4 years. The American people are more resolute than ever. Now they are getting much better at fighting. Now the French are helping them. Seeing the writing on the wall, this war is just too expensive. So Britain capitulated and agreed to grant independence to the colonies. Official independence would not come until 1783. Official independence would not come until 1783, and that would be the Treaty of Paris. That would be the Treaty of Paris. One more figure that we need to mention is a French nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was also a close friend of Washington, and he had very good connections all the way up to King Louis. And Lafayette played a key role, not just in fighting the war. He led American soldiers, but he also played a key role as a diplomat, getting the French to send over guns, getting the French to send over money, convincing the king that the Americans really can win this, which would be a huge advantage to France. And so Lafayette is one of our founding fathers that was not, in fact, American at all. He is the one French founding father that we have. And if you go to his tomb today, and he would also play a big role during the French Revolution. He had a really crazy career, but of course his tomb in France today has an American flag on it. And as I understand it, during World War II, when we liberated Paris, after we invaded in Normandy and we drove the Germans out, when we liberated Paris, one of the first things was that Eisenhower sent men to go guard Lafayette's tomb. That was to make sure that Lafayette's tomb was not going to be vandalized or anything like that. So that's just kind of an interesting side note, is that we have a founding father buried in Paris. Now, the war's over. The war has ended. We are independent. Now the big question is, we have to build a government. We actually have to create a country, which is going to be a whole new set of challenges and a whole new set of issues. And it's something we'll deal with on Tuesday. So what do you say we go ahead and call it a day? Remember, we do have a quiz that opens, okay? Get the discussions done, and if you have any questions, let me know.